Have you ever read something so powerful that for a moment the silence seemed louder than any scream? A simple sentence, handwritten, shaky, almost illegible, was enough to silence the entire cell. Forgive me for the monster I was. 7. Words. A sentence that transformed a yellowed piece of paper into an abyss of unanswered questions. Who was this man? What did he do? And most importantly, it's why now. This letter was not found by chance. It was there, folded carefully, on the worn mattress in cell 12, as if waiting to be read at the exact moment. And when the police found the paper, something changed in the air. Even those most accustomed to the worst hesitated. It wasn't just another goodbye note. It was a request for forgiveness that seemed more like a whisper coming from the darkness. Have you ever been through this? Read something and feel as if that pain had crossed time just to reach you in the narrow corridors of the prison, where every sound echoes and every silence weighs heavily. The phrase spread like a spark in dry straw. Guards whispered. Inmates stopped to listen. Reporters waited for any clue that could explain what was hiding behind that monster, and nobody knew. Not even those who watched him every day. A criminal who rarely spoke, never showed remorse, and who now left behind a confession as enigmatic as it was disturbing. Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now may surprise you, and maybe even stir something inside. This is not just a crime story. It's about the ghosts we carry, about what no one sees behind bars, and about a moment when even the most hardened of men seems to want to go back in time. The letter became the centerpiece of an informal investigation. Cellmates were questioned, psychologists revisited old reports, and even his childhood history came to light. The prison system, accustomed to numbers and recidivism, was forced to face a deeper question. Are monsters born or created? Every word of the note was analyzed, every detail of the cell revisited. The atmosphere among prison officers was tense. Some said he was going crazy the last few days, others that he had found some kind of silent redemption. But what really motivated that sentence? What did he know or feel that no one else knew? And perhaps most disconcertingly, is this play for forgiveness a sign of change or just part of the terror itself? In the next few minutes, we will delve into this case that shook not only the prison, but also those who believe that everyone has a point of return. Get ready, because what comes now will open a door that may be difficult to close. Open a door that may be difficult to close. And that's exactly where I want to invite you to join this reflection. Because this type of story, however distant it may seem from our reality, touches on points that are universal. Guilt, forgiveness, transformation. Maybe you've experienced something similar, or known someone who had a difficult to explain past. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you most so far. Sometimes sharing an experience, a doubt, or even a feeling that arose during the video can be a relief. And more than that, it can inspire other people who are also here, listening to all of this with an open heart. And look, if you've made it this far, it's because something in this story grabbed you. So take the opportunity to like the video, not only to give that support, but because it really helps to make this content reach more people who perhaps need to hear exactly this today. Every like, every comment, every subscription here on the channel makes a huge difference. It's no exaggeration to say that this is what keeps this space alive, a space where real stories, however harsh they may be, gain a voice. So, if you want to continue following these cases that provoke, question, and above all make you feel, sign up now. Really, your presence here is what gives meaning to all of this. But calm down, because this story is far from over. There's still a lot you need to know, and what comes next could completely change the way you see that note. The letter found in that cell was not an isolated case. It was just the starting point for something much bigger. Because the truth is that behind bars, sentences, and case numbers, there are voices that almost never reach us. Voices that speak at the last moment. Voices of those who are about to cross the final line and know that after that, there is nothing left. Today, we will delve into this dark, complex, and at the same time, deeply human territory. The last words of convicted murderers. Would you be prepared to hear these confessions? This topic is more than a morbid curiosity. It reveals a side of the human being that most prefer to ignore. The final moment. That moment when, with no way to escape, the truth needs to come out, or at least a version of it. What do these people say moments before the execution? What do they carry in their voice, repentance, coldness, one last cry of despair or provocation? In many cases, the last words are documented, archived, forgotten in official reports. But when you listen carefully, you realize that there is more to it than just simple phrases. There are lapses of lucidity, fragments of a story that no one has told in full, signs of a late transformation, or perhaps just the final reflection of madness. One of the most emblematic cases is that of Aileen Wuornos. A woman who killed 7 men was sentenced to death and, on the day of her execution, looked at those watching her on the other side of the glass and said, "I will be back, like in the movie Independence Day, with Jesus." Surreal phrase. No regrets, no explanations. An enigmatic message that left experts trying to decipher whether it was irony, mental distortion, or just the way she found to deal with the end. This is where we enter a gray area, where not everything is black and white, where even madness has logic, even if crooked. Others leave words that seem to carry tons of pain, like assassin John Allen Muhammad, known as the Beltway shooter. He remained absolutely silent throughout the trial, cold, calculating. But before the execution, his last gestures were prayer. No words, no justification, just silence. And that says a lot. Sometimes what is not said speaks louder. It's strange to think that with their last breath, someone might want to change the entire narrative of their life. And yet, many try. Some ask for forgiveness, others claim innocence. Until the end. Some send messages to their children, their mothers, those they left injured along the way. And there are those who use this moment as a stage to reaffirm their own hatred. The hidden truth that emerges in these final minutes forces us to face a question that has no easy answer. What is justice when there is no more time for redemption? Criminal psychology tries to understand this behavior. There are theories that talk about symbolic redemption, when the condemned, upon realizing that death is inevitable, tries to leave an image different from that recorded in the courts and in the headlines. A kind of moral reconstruction, in seconds, as if to say, "I wasn't just that." It may seem absurd, but this reveals a lot about our need for meaning, even in the face of the end. The impact of these words goes beyond prison walls. For victims' families, each sentence can be like a wound being reopened, or in rare cases, a small relief. For society, they are records that help to understand human behavior in its darkest extremities, and for those who listen, they can be an internal call. If this were your last chance to speak, what would you say? There is a certain fascination with this topic because it forces us to look squarely at what we avoid. And sometimes we see ourselves in small parts of these speeches, in the fears, in the guilt, in the unresolved requests. Because no matter how horrendous the crimes were, no matter how revolting they may seem, they are still human voices. And perhaps that is precisely what bothers the most, realizing that the monster still carries a trace of humanity. These latest reports also expose the behind-the-scenes of the prison system, where there is not always room for reflection or true repentance. Many enter broken and leave even more destroyed when they leave, and those who go all the way usually carry emotional baggage that has never even been named. These are old traumas, decisions that were chained together in a spiral of destruction, a mentality shaped by pain, abandonment, and violence. Execution in this context is not just the end of a life, it is the end point of a story that often began poorly told. And here comes something essential. How much of these last words are real and how much are performative? In many cases, the condemned know that their final sentences will be recorded, repeated, judged. Does this influence what is said? Probably yes, because deep down, even at the last minute, everyone wants to be heard. They want to leave a mark, even if that mark is a desperate scream or a request for forgiveness, whispered in a trembling voice. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is to note that some of these confessions, however bizarre or cold they may seem, were not made by irrational psychopaths but by people who at some point made choices, many of them irreversible. And that's when the line between good and evil stops being so clear. Because behind every sentence said before the end, there is a story that does not fit into a criminal sentence. Now that you've heard all this, tell me one thing. If someone gave you a transcript of a criminal's last words, would you read it to the end or would you rather not know? Comment there. I want to understand what's behind it. And when time becomes an irreversible countdown, what happens inside the mind of someone who no longer has an escape? This is one of the most disturbing and most avoided questions when we talk about death row, because we are not just dealing with punishment, but with the conscious anticipation of the end. And that, according to experts, transforms everything. Forensic psychologists call this phenomenon terminal consciousness, a mental state that emerges when a person understands with absolute clarity that they are living their last days, hours, minutes. The human mind has been shaped throughout history to avoid the thought of death. We distract ourselves, we plan, we project the future, precisely to avoid facing the abyss of the end. But on death row, there aren't enough distractions. Every step is a reminder. Every door that closes, every dish served, every noise at night. And this creates a kind of psychological pressure that challenges everything we understand about human behavior. The person is not just trapped, they are trapped in a timeline where the last page has already been written. Dr. James Gilligan, a renowned forensic psychiatrist and author of numerous studies on violence and punishment, described this state as a progressive dissolution of denial. According to him, many people sentenced to death go through phases of resistance, despair, resignation, and in some cases, transformation. But not everyone reaches the end in the same way. Some collapse internally. Others become more lucid than they have ever been in their lives. There are those who say that, faced with the certainty of death, the truth reveals itself with brutal clarity. But what kind of truth is this? There are records of convicts who began to develop behaviors that they did not have before. Extreme anxiety, panic attacks, continuous insomnia, or even psychotic episodes. But there are also surprising accounts of self-discovery, letters written with deep regret, genuine attempts to understand the harm they have caused, not as a defense, but as a final effort at redemption. It's as if, seeing the end approaching, some of them are able to look in the mirror for the first time without the masks they've worn their entire lives. An example that marked many professionals in the field was the case of a man named Michael, executed in 2006. He had spent almost 17 years on death row. During this time, he was accompanied by psychologists and spiritual assistants. In the last 2 months of his life, he began to write compulsively, not just letters to his family, but reflections on himself, on his violent childhood, on the mistakes that led him there. One of the excerpts said, "Now that everything is going to end, I realize that I was just another product of a sequence of decisions that no one wanted to see." These words don't erase what he did, but they point to a painful revelation. The making of a killer rarely begins on the spot. It is born in layers, often invisible, shaped by trauma, neglect, and a survival-at-any-cost mentality. When the end is inevitable, these layers become visible. And it is at this point that terminal consciousness differs from any other psychological state. It forces a confrontation with everything that was avoided before, with one's own choices, yes, but also with one's own pain. It is interesting to note that, in many cases, convicts begin to demonstrate altruistic behavior. They ask to donate their own organs. They try to help young people not to follow the same path. They write texts warning about the dangers of violence. That doesn't erase what they did, of course, but it raises an uncomfortable question. Why do many people only wake up to the impact of their decisions at the end? Does only death have the power to break the ego's defenses? In practice, death row functions as a space where time becomes almost an entity. The days pass differently. Daily. Life is marked by strict protocols, isolation, and silent waiting. Some even live there for decades, living daily with the certainty of their own end. And this changes the way you think, feel, even breathe. The body responds to this state with constant tension, and the mind begins to operate in cycles, sometimes of lucidity, sometimes of delirium. It's a behind the scenes that few people know about. There are also those who refuse any type of dialogue. They don't want psychologists. They don't write letters. They don't leave final messages. It is as if, faced with history itself, silence was the only possible response. But even this silence carries weight. He also communicates. And for those watching from the outside, it is sometimes the most disturbing of all signs. Others immerse themselves in religions, rituals, or beliefs they have never followed before. They seek comfort, forgiveness, explanations. In many cases, spirituality appears not as an escape, but as an attempt at reconstruction, even if late. It is another facet of this internal journey, marked by regrets that weigh too much and memories that refuse to disappear. The mind starts to revisit scenes from the past with frightening clarity. Some report vivid dreams with the victims, with family members, with childhood places. It's as if the unconscious takes the bill for what was poorly resolved. And as the end date approaches, the mood changes. The guard's steps seem heavier, their gazes avoid contact, and silence settles in like a constant presence. Even the sounds in the cell change. It is in this context that the last words begin to be rehearsed, even if they are never said out loud. It is there, behind the scenes of execution, that the human mind reveals what it is really made of. Given all of this, an inevitable question arises. Could it be that if these men and women had been heard earlier, not at the end, but at the beginning of the journey, could anything have been different? Comment there. Is there still someone trying to save themselves inside? The letter was there, carefully folded, resting on the thin foam pillow as if it had been left for a purpose. The paper was simple, lined, the kind common in school. Notebooks. The paint, dark blue. The handwriting, firm but busy. And the first sentence was all it took to transform that ordinary cell into a breaking point. Forgive me for the monster I was. It was January 2013 at the Pedrinhas Penitentiary Complex in Maranhão. The inmate was Claudio Ferreira da Silva, 41 years old, convicted of double murder. He was not known for being violent when interacting with other prisoners, but he also never approached anyone. I didn't receive visitors. He did not participate in rehabilitation programs. In the records, it was just another number, one more face among many. But on that sultry morning, when the agents opened the cell for the round, something made them stop. The position of the body, the dense silence, the note. Claudio had taken his own life and left beyond the body words that would echo far beyond the bars. He didn't ask them to call a lawyer. He left no messages for his family. He just wanted to write. I just wanted to be read. The letter, according to agents, was 3 pages long. The first was the most direct, a request for forgiveness, but not just for the deaths he committed. He talked about his childhood when he ran away from home at the age of 9. He spoke of hunger, of nights under overpasses, of his first arrests for petty theft. It described the feeling of becoming invisible, and he confessed. What I did afterwards was just the consequence of already feeling dead inside. On the second page, he detailed the crimes, not like a cold script, but like someone who relives it with shame. He said he didn't sleep anymore, that the faces of the victims appeared every night, and that, over time, he also started to see his own younger face, as if something inside him begged to go back in time. If I could take that 9-year-old boy by the hand, I wouldn't let him leave the house. This phrase moved even the most experienced prison guards. The third part of the letter seemed like an outburst against the system. He did not place himself as a victim. On the contrary, he said he deserved to be there. But he questioned why no one saw it before. Why were so many signs ignored? And in the midst of bitter sentences, he blurted out something that seemed like hope. I don't want anyone to admire me. I just want someone someday to understand that I wasn't born this way. The agent's reaction was unusual. One of them, according to the unit director, cried when he read it. Another asked to leave the following day. It was as if that letter showed us that physical imprisonment is only part of the punishment. The rest, he himself had already been living inside for a long time, he said. And it is exactly this type of revelation that deconstructs the idea of the criminal as a unilateral figure. Because when you read words like these, You understand that you are not facing a simple police report, but rather a journey marked by pain, by absence, and by a series of decisions made in the dark. This type of document rarely makes the headlines. It doesn't generate an audience. It doesn't feed the narrative of quick punishment. But it has incalculable value when it comes to understanding the mentality behind violence. Claudio did not seek to justify his actions. He faced them with a courage that he may never have had in life. And that changes everything. Because somehow his death became more than an end. It has become a mirror for the system, for society, and mainly for those who think they understand everything about what is right or wrong just based on labels. Of course, a letter does not erase what was done, but it can reveal the hidden truth behind what is seen in the courts. It can show that sometimes what we call a monster is the end result of a story that began long before the crime. A story full of failures, of abandonment, of silent loneliness, and that's why it matters. Because it's not enough to punish. If we don't understand the process that takes someone to this point, everything continues to repeat itself, from generation to generation. Claudio was neither the first nor the last to write before leaving. But the impact of those pages continued to reverberate in the corridors of Pedrinhas for weeks. Some inmates began to seek psychological support. Others asked to write letters too. Small cracks appeared in that thick wall of insensitivity that usually forms there. It was a silent domino effect, almost invisible to anyone looking from the outside, but real. And what remains of all this is not just the tragedy of the end, but the strength contained in what almost no one sees. The attempt, even with no way out, to make someone see what happened inside. The complexity of the human mind. In the face of guilt, time, silence, and waiting. Now think, if you only had a blank sheet of paper and the certainty that no one would interrupt you, what would you write? Comment there. If it were me, what would I have the courage to say? Not every tear is a sincere request for forgiveness, and not all silence carries regret. When we talk about the last words of convicted criminals, it is impossible to ignore this question that always lingers around. Is it real remorse, or just a carefully calculated act? This fine line between feeling and simulating is precisely what challenges experts the most, and also what intrigues us most as a society. Science has been looking at this for decades. Psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, and neuroscientists seek to understand what really goes on in the mind of someone who commits extreme acts and then claims to be sorry. There is a stark difference between genuine emotion and trained speech, and it is precisely at this point that concepts such as psychopathy and empathy come into play. Simply put, psychopathy is not just the absence of guilt. It is a condition that involves a persistent pattern of behavior, where the other has no real value, only utility. People with this trait tend to manipulate easily. They know exactly what to say to make the desired impact, but they don't actually feel what they demonstrate. Emotional coldness, in this case, is not a lack of control. It's internal structure. It's the way they were shaped, often from a very early age, to survive without real emotional ties. Studies show that psychopaths can identify emotions in others with incredible accuracy. They can, for example, notice when someone is sad, vulnerable, or afraid. But this perception is not accompanied by empathy. It's as if they read these emotions in the same way that an actor studies a script, focusing on the reaction they can provoke, not on the connection with the feeling. This means that many know how to show regret, and they even cry, tremble, speak with a choked voice, but none of this is necessarily a reflection of internal pain. This is where the challenge arises. How to know if the person who says "forgive me" is really being overcome by the awareness of what they have done, or just trying to soften their own image, control the impact, or even seek some type of strategic relief. It is not always possible to have this answer clearly, and perhaps the most honest thing to say is that even the most experienced experts still deal with profound uncertainties when it comes to true repentance. But there are nuances, because not all criminals are psychopaths. This is a common but dangerous misconception. Most violent inmates do not have antisocial personality disorder, to an extreme degree. Many do have deep traumas, cognitive distortions, uncontrolled impulsivity, environments marked by violence since childhood. And this influences but does not erase responsibility for actions. Science also investigates empathy in so-called reactive criminals, those who commit crimes driven by anger, jealousy, despair, or emotional outbursts. These, unlike psychopaths, generally feel guilt. Their mind is capable of revisiting the act with suffering, remorse, and even disgust. In brain scanning studies, it was possible to notice activity in areas related to emotional pain when these people talk about what they did. They are not just remembering, they are reliving it with a real emotional charge. This is where things get even more delicate. Because the criminal justice system is often not prepared to deal with this complexity, either the individual is seen as completely monstrous, with no possibility of change, or as someone who has supposedly changed but is only pretending. The truth, as always, usually lies in the middle of the road. This discussion is not just technical, it touches on a deep part of our own social mentality, the belief that repentance must come with visible suffering, that someone remorseful needs to be destroyed inside, crying on camera, begging for forgiveness. But is this the only valid way to demonstrate transformation? What if true repentance is silent, timid, difficult to put into words? Does the absence of tears invalidate what is being felt? Behind the scenes of trials, many professionals report difficulties in evaluating these behaviors. Public defenders, prosecutors, psychologists, and even judges have admitted that, when faced with certain final speeches, they get the feeling that something there is genuine, but without being able to prove it. It's an emotional limbo where the hidden truth hides beneath layers of defense, shame, fear, or pure strategy. The answer is not simple, and perhaps never will be. But what science shows us is that yes, true repentance exists. It may come late, it may come in a crooked way, but it appears, especially in those who begin to develop empathy along the journey. Sometimes a single moment of silence, a small gesture, or even a handwritten sentence already indicates this internal turn, not as an excuse but as part of a deep process of psychological reconstruction. But you also need to be aware that not every confession is honest, and that is precisely why listening cannot be a passive act. You need to know how to listen with discernment, with humanity, but without naivety, because there, on that boundary between emotion and calculation, lies one of the most difficult decisions, whether or not to believe in the change of someone who did the unthinkable. And when doubt remains, perhaps the most powerful question is not, is he sorry, but rather, what would I do if I were in his shoes with everything he lived and did? Comment there. How do you know if regret is real? As the serum slowly dripped down the tube and the clock ticked down to the last seconds of that man's life, the silence in the room was almost absolute. Guards, nurses, witnesses. Everyone was attentive, perhaps waiting for some gesture, a word of regret, a look that said, "I understood." But what happened was the opposite. A dry whisper, pronounced with the calmness of someone ordering a coffee. "They deserved it." The phrase came from the mouth of Marcos Elias Ribeiro, convicted of a series of brutal murders committed between 1996 and 2002 in the interior of São Paulo. 7 victims, all women. The pattern was almost always the same: careful approach, psychological manipulation, methodical cruelty. He was nicknamed by the press at the time as O Sorriso da Serra because of his apparently gentle behavior and the coldness with which he told the details of the crimes during the trial, always with a slight smile on his face. In the cell, he kept himself isolated, spoke little, read a lot. Psychologists tried to contact him numerous times, but he refused any kind of in-depth assessment. He said he didn't want to justify anything, that he didn't need it. It was only in the last month before the execution that he agreed to speak to an investigative reporter. And what was recorded there left even the most skeptical people disconcerted. When asked if he felt guilty, the answer came without hesitation. Guilt is what you invented to sleep better. And when asked if he would do anything differently if he could go back in time, he responded with an almost didactic tone, "No, I would do it all over again, because nothing has changed inside me." This kind of statement challenges everything we understand about human transformation, because there is no ambiguity. There is no painful confession. There is not a shred of doubt. It is a raw conviction without masks, and this has a direct impact on those around. One of the nurses who accompanied the execution reported years later that what struck him most was not the violence of the crimes themselves, but Marcos's behavior in the final minutes. He didn't shake, he didn't sweat, he didn't blink. It was like I were at peace. This type of attitude and the total absence of remorse is not common, even among violent criminals. And when it appears, it raises an important alert about the emotional functioning of these individuals. Unlike what we see in films or series, most convicts show at some level signs of internal conflict, but not Marcos. He seemed to have achieved a kind of coldness that goes beyond clinical psychopathy. It was a complete detachment from other people's pain, as if none of it happened to him. For professionals who work within the criminal system, this type of case is like facing the abyss of the human mind. Because there is no dialogue possible, there is no rescue. What exists there is just an observation. Certain people really do not access what we call empathy, and it's difficult, even for those who deal with this every day, to accept that there is a limit to what we can understand. Marcos's look during the lethal injection was described by one of the agents as invasive. He didn't look away. He observed the reactions of others as if he were evaluating the effect of his own presence, and he didn't say anything else after those 3 words. No sighs, no tears. Just that still face like a statue carved in disdain. This type of behavior forces us to confront the hidden truth behind premeditated violence, because contrary to what many think, not all evil comes from pain. Sometimes it comes from the void. A structural void, built throughout a journey without emotional bonds, without moral restraints, without real limits. And when this void is organized intelligently, the result is a personality that may seem charming on the outside, but absolutely destructive on the inside. There is a fundamental difference between someone who makes a mistake, breaks down, and tries to understand what happened, and someone who never saw a problem with hurting. Marcos belonged to the second group, and the fact that he was fully aware of what he was doing, and yet repeated without guilt that he would do it all over again, reveals a mentality shaped for control, not transformation. And it is important to understand that this does not serve to justify fear or fuel sensationalism. It serves to reinforce how essential it is to deepen our perspective on behavior, decisions, and responsibility. Because each crime committed by people like Marcos carries a series of previous signs, ignored clues, warnings that went unnoticed. And if we don't learn to see this before the tragedy, we will continue to arrive too late. These extreme cases reveal the darkest side of human nature, but they also leave inevitable questions hanging in the air. What makes someone completely disconnect from someone else's pain? At what point in the internal journey does this disconnection happen? And the most uncomfortable thing, is everyone to some extent capable of this? Or are certain brains really born with something less? These are questions that psychology, neuroscience, and society itself are still trying to answer. But until the answers arrive completely, it remains for us to observe carefully, not only the actions but behind the scenes, the invisible layers that precede each decision, because sometimes that's where the warning sign lives that can make all the difference. Now think with me. When faced with someone who says, "I would do it all again," which would you feel first? Fear, anger, or pity? Comment there. Is there redemption for everyone? When we think about killers who leave messages before their execution, we are often faced with a disturbing reality, a past marked by deep trauma. In most cases, these individuals have something in common, a destroyed childhood filled with abuse, neglect, or abandonment. It's difficult to imagine how much a dark past can impact a person's trajectory, but when we look at the stories of killers, we can see how these traumas are intertwined with fateful decisions that lead to violence. The cycle of abuse, neglect, and a childhood marked by mistreatment can generate a radical change in the formation of someone's personality. When a child grows up in a violent environment without the necessary emotional support or the presence of authority figures to convey love and care, the result can be devastating. Aggressive behavior, lack of empathy, and even the search for Control over others often emerge as responses to these experiences that no one should have to live. And in the case of some criminals, what we see is a disconnected emotional response, as if their life has already been distorted in such a way that the suffering of others becomes just another part of the path. Of course, not every individual who goes through abuse and trauma in childhood will become a criminal, but it is undeniable that the relationship between traumatic events in youth and the choice of a life marked by violence is an extremely relevant topic. Criminal psychology experts often report that the childhood histories of many murderers are full of signs that could have been detected and treated, but most often these signs are ignored until the behavior is deeply ingrained. The words of some of these criminals about their parents or the abuse they suffered are like a reflection of a pain that they were unable to process. Many of them say the violence in their homes is what shaped them. Experiences of abandonment, verbal and physical abuse created a vicious cycle of anger and resentment. The truth is that the abused child often carries these traumas like a shadow throughout their lives, and that shadow can become something much darker. What seemed to be an emotional response in youth turns, in adulthood, into a tendency to resolve conflicts in a brutal way, where empathy is almost non-existent. But in addition to suffering, there is also a coldness that settles in some of these individuals. Emotional emptiness, as if there was nothing left to lose, often becomes the fuel for unthinkable actions. Criminal psychology explains that for some, violence becomes a way of regaining the control that was denied to them throughout their childhood. This pattern of behavior is what often leads them to crime, where they exercise a kind of power over their victims, something they have never been able to have over their own lives. However, it is important to highlight that not all criminals have a history of abuse or trauma. Although it is a relevant factor, the decision to commit a crime, especially homicide, is not determined solely by an individual's past. Psychology also points out that there are other factors, such as genetics, social influences, and personal choices, that play an important role in the formation of a criminal mind, which leads us to question to what extent the responsibility for these actions is solely attributable to the environment, or whether there is a part of the human being that already has a predisposition to follow dark paths. The most interesting thing about all of this is how these stories can intertwine with the concept of repentance and conscience. Many criminals, when faced with the approach of their execution or the end of their lives, seem to confront their own demons. But is repentance genuine? Or is it just another strategy to manipulate others in an attempt to gain the sympathy of those who observe them? The psychology of regret is complex, as in some cases, the criminal's lack of empathy and coldness do not allow for true reflection on their actions. What we see most of the time are empty words, spoken by those who never had the ability to feel the weight of their choices. It is in this context that we can analyze specific cases, such as criminals who make shocking confessions, and even so, do not show the slightest remorse. On the contrary, there are those whose words seem to be a cry of pain, a belated attempt to seek forgiveness for something that can never be undone. This dilemma between genuine remorse and emotional manipulation is something that leaves many perplexed. It is almost as if at the end of their journey, these criminals come across a hidden truth, an internal transformation that somehow leads them to recognize, even if too late, the gravity of their actions. But can repentance really arise when the mind has already been profoundly changed? Now, I want to further explore how trauma and human psychology intertwine in the choices these individuals make. After all, how does a criminal's mind develop over time? What else, other than environment and life experiences, can lead someone to make such extreme choices? Let's dive even deeper into this issue and better understand the behind the scenes of criminal psychology and the impact of trauma on human behavior. Silence is a response that, in itself, carries immense weight. When a convict reaches the end of his journey and refuses to speak, the situation becomes even more intriguing. The lack of words in this context can be much more significant than any confession. For many of these individuals, silence becomes a last form of control, a way to keep the power in their hands, even when the end is about to come. Instead of offering words of repentance or explanations, they choose to remain silent, as if speech is something they cannot or will not give to anyone. It's curious to think about what this silence really reveals about the state of these killers' minds. Psychology teaches us that in many cases, silence is a way to avoid confronting the reality of your actions. Some psychologists argue that this behavior may be an expression of contempt, a form of disdain for the entire process that is happening around you. So, for these criminals, the absence of words can be a form of rejection of everything that is considered morally right, including the very idea of repentance or remorse. On the other hand, this silence can also be seen as a response deeply rooted in guilt. When someone finds themselves in an irreversible situation where there is no turning back, the weight of guilt can be so great that the only possible reaction is silence. It's as if words aren't enough to express what's happening inside. Silence in this case is not an attempt at manipulation or control, but rather a way of protecting one's own being from the overwhelming awareness of what has been done. And finally, silence can also manifest as denial. By not speaking, the killer may be trying to convince himself that nothing happened or that his death has no relevance. For some, this is a way to avoid the shame, pain, and embarrassment of their own actions. They prefer to close their eyes to the truth, because facing it head-on is something that can destroy the entire mental construction they have created over the years, a construction that protects them from facing their actions clearly and brutally. This behavior leads us to reflect on what really happens in the minds of these individuals. Absolute silence can be one of the greatest indicators of how human beings deal with guilt, contempt, and denial in the face of something irreversible. The psychology of criminals who choose this stance is complex and profound. They put themselves in a position where words become unnecessary, as their silence says more about their mindset than any confession or apology ever could. In many of these cases, what we see is that even when these individuals are confronted with the truth of their actions, they choose silence as if they want to preserve a facade of control, power, or even complete emotional disconnection, which leads us to question the extent to which the human mind can disconnect from the reality of its own actions, creating defenses so strong that the simple act of speaking becomes almost impossible. And this connects directly with something that many criminal psychology scholars raise: human behavior when faced with the truth, when it becomes intolerable. This silence, as disconcerting as it may be, is one of the most revealing ways a criminal's mind can work. But what does this teach us about human beings? What can this behavior tell us about the depths of criminal psychology and how it can be shaped by a lifetime of choices, experiences, and perhaps hidden suffering? As we explore more about the behavior of criminals, it becomes clear that the human mind, when put to the test, can be a difficult thing to understand. Sometimes she closes down, defends herself, and silence becomes the last answer. But what is the real reason behind this? What does this behavior try to hide or reveal? These are questions that take us on an even deeper journey into the impact of a human being's life and their decisions. With all this in mind, it is impossible not to reflect on how the human mind adapts, protects itself, and transforms in the face of extreme experiences. And perhaps most fascinating is how much it can teach us about ourselves. How do our own experiences shape our responses to pain, regret, and guilt? How do we protect ourselves from the most difficult truths to face? Now, when thinking about the impact of all these revelations and what they really mean, we can't help but wonder, how do you react when faced with life's most extreme situations? Comment. What does this say about us? As the conversation progresses and we try to understand the minds of the killers on death row, it is impossible not to wonder, who are these people really? Are they monsters or human beings who have somehow reached the limit of what a person can bear? What makes us look at them with such judgment? And at the same time, what can we learn about ourselves by trying to understand the stories that got them to this point? It is very easy to categorize these individuals as monsters, irrational and cruel creatures, but in doing so, we end up ignoring a fundamental fact. No one is born like this. All of us human beings have a story, and however painful or twisted some of these people's journeys may be, it is a human journey. The idea that these individuals were made by a system, a society, or even life itself makes us think about something profound and often uncomfortable. To what extent is our humanity shaped by the circumstances into which we are born? What would happen if we were in the place of these murderers? Would we also have the same capacity to commit atrocities, or would we be victims of a system that in some way would push us to the bottom of an abyss with no return? The concept of monster often leads us to a simplified and reductionist view, where human beings are stripped of all the complexity of their history, their pain, and their choices. The line between good and evil, right and wrong, becomes a much thinner line than we would like to believe. What makes someone commit a brutal crime? Could it be that at some point, somewhere, this person had a different chance, an opportunity to change their trajectory, to choose another path? When we look at these killers, there is a tendency to move away from them emotionally. We think that to preserve our own psychological safety, we must believe that we are different, that we would never do something similar. But what if this was a lie? What if, instead of looking at these people as monsters, we started looking at them with more empathy, with the understanding that every human being carries within them a story of trauma, loss, and wrong choices? Of course, we are not saying that his crimes should be forgiven or that his actions should be excused. However, by trying to understand the motivations behind these choices, we can begin to realize that violence is often not just an act of pure evil, but the result of a journey of pain and hopelessness. It seems difficult to accept this idea, doesn't it? The temptation to separate the good from the bad is one of the simplest answers we have to deal with the complexity of human behavior. However, reality rarely fits into such narrow categories. When we look at these figures, there is always a part of us that wants to understand what they experienced, what led them to this point, and it forces us to reflect on our own choices, our own experiences, and how they shape us. Someone's last sentence, especially someone in such an extreme moment, can be a profound reflection of their inner journey. When death is so close, when there is no turning back, the last word can be the last attempt to express what was never said, what was never understood. Behind every death sentence, there is a life, a story, a pain, and this phrase is often not just a confession or a late repentance. It may be the echo of a hidden truth, something that is still trapped inside that person, but that they know will not be heard. Now stop for a moment and think. If you were in their shoes, what would your last sentence be? What would you say? To the world or to yourself, knowing that the end is near and that perhaps this is the last opportunity to say something meaningful? It's not an easy question to answer, because it puts us in a vulnerable position. It forces us to confront our own limits, our own choices, and our own failures. This brings us to a crucial point. What really defines a person? Is it what she did or what she went through? The idea of being human goes beyond the acts we commit. It goes beyond what we fail to do. We are constantly on a journey of self-discovery, of choices, and often the most difficult decisions are made when we are confronted with our greatest pains. And as we reflect on all this, one thing becomes clear. The human mind is a deep and complex territory. The decisions we make, what we choose to do with our pain and our circumstances, all shape who we are and how we act in the world. But does it happen that when we are faced with death, guilt, and regret, all of this dissolves in a simple last word? Or is it that no matter how hard we try to stay away, true human nature, with all its flaws and vulnerabilities, always ends up emerging? This reflection takes us to a much deeper place than we would like to explore, as it challenges us to reconsider what it means to be truly human. After all, how far does our responsibility go in everything we do? And most importantly, what happens when we reach the end of our journey and there is no turning back? Comment. What does someone's last sentence say about us? As we reflect on the humanity behind these people's actions and decisions, the complexity of their psyche begins to emerge. Each of these stories brings to light a reality that is much more intricate than we can perceive at first glance. Could everything these individuals did be attributed to a single failure, or is there something deeper that led them there? This brings us to an essential point. How can we understand the impact of pain, transformation, and choices throughout our own lives. Are we really prepared to understand the weight of each word, each decision when the line between victim and aggressor blurs, revealing aspects that perhaps we would prefer not to face? Thinking about this goes beyond mere curiosity. Human nature, with all its flaws and virtues, is connected in ways that we often fail to fully realize. Every word we speak, every action we take, shapes who we are, but also reverberates in others, in unexpected ways. When these individuals, whose lives have been marked by so much pain and destruction, leave one last word, what is really being said? Is this an attempt at redemption? A request for forgiveness that was never heard? Or simply the realization that death, and not life, was the only chance to free themselves from the invisible chains that imprisoned them? Now, as these questions echo in our minds, I invite you to reflect. If these words could tell us something deeper about ourselves, what would they reveal? What can someone's last words, even in such extreme circumstances, teach us about empathy, judgment, and the true nature of guilt? This is an important inflection point. We often tend to define someone by their actions, but isn't this definition constantly changing? What makes us who we are, and could it be that at some point in our lives we are all just victims of circumstances that were beyond our control? We are not just talking about criminals or people in extreme situations, but about all of us, with our fears, insecurities, and flaws. We all have something to learn about how life shapes our choices. These questions put us in a delicate position, because as we face the harshness of these individuals' actions, we are also challenging the way we see the world and the choices we make every day. The truth is that often the impact of our decisions goes far beyond what we can immediately understand. They can have repercussions we can't even imagine, affecting the people around us in invisible and profound ways. And as we try to find answers to these questions, we are forced to look into the mirror of our own existence and reflect on what truly defines us. Sometimes words can be powerful, capable of revealing as much about the outer world as the inner world. Therefore, we cannot help but ask ourselves, what will be the last word we will give to the world? Will we be able to use our words to transform something within ourselves, to correct what needs to be corrected, and to free ourselves from the ghosts of the past? This is an invitation to deeper reflection on what it really means to be human. We cannot close our eyes to the complexity of life and human behavior, because in doing so, we run the risk of ignoring what is behind every action, every word, and even every silence. After all, what is more revealing, the action or the lack of it? And when finally we are faced with the last opportunity to speak, what will be said? What really matters in the end? Therefore, the journey of understanding and reflecting on these issues does not end here. It continues in our own lives, in our choices, and in the way we deal with the consequences of our actions. So tell me, what do you think about all this? Which of these last words impacted you the most? Comment here. What is your opinion about what defines a person after all? And then, if you've gotten this far, it's because somehow this reflection touched something inside you, just as it touched me while I was talking about it. If this content made sense or brought something new to think about, leave a like. I think we managed to create a good connection, right? And if you want to continue on this journey of understanding, there is a video here that complements this conversation well. Click and follow me there. And of course, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe. I promise that the content that comes next will be equally interesting. Oh, and if you made it to the end, write in the comments, this reflection is for me. I'd love to know what you think about all this. See you soon.